I have deliberately steered all my internships and my trainings towards trauma healing. And why is that? It's not because I was sexually abused or physically abused or even emotionally abused by my parents, but rather I was emotionally neglected. And I was emotionally neglected to a point where I grew up with a mixture of anxiety and depression that they never recognized, or at least wouldn't acknowledge. And I didn't get any help for it until I was in college, which is actually a very common time for people to kind of feel all this distress, because you're thrown into a highly social world and you have all these mirrors and all these people to compare yourself to, and you may not feel adequate. And then that raises the question, why don't I feel adequate? And it opens up this whole can of worms. And I've been in therapy ever since. And the good news is that I feel like I have largely worked the bugs out, and that although trauma healing is forever, right? It never really ends. I feel like I'm on the other side and in a good position to help clients. So that's kind of my story.
Thank you so much, Harvey. That's such a beautiful, authentic, and vulnerable place to share. And it really speaks to, myself included, our journeys as wounded healers, or the journey of the wounded healer, and
Sure.
Addressing our own history and letting that inform the fabric from which we serve, so that we're not disconnected and dissociated from the soil that we have chosen to cycle break from.
Yeah.
That's just so powerful. Like, and it's using the context of the field that you and I share with internal family systems, having a lens to compassionately view our past so that we're not resisting it. And it's kind of more like, I've used this term recently a lot more than I ever used to, loving on it versus like loving on it versus like trampling over it.
Yeah.
Meet the needs of what wasn't there at the time. Yeah.
Right. So I completely agree, Eileen, in with what you're saying. And one thing about IFS that really attracted me to it was the saying that all parts are welcome. And learning to value and even love parts that are in some ways dysfunctional, and you learn that the dysfunctionality was actually a survival mechanism for your past. In other words, you unconsciously chose a strategy to numb your pain or distract you from pain, and it has stayed with you long past the point at which you're living with mom and dad. And it's really become your identity, so you think, but it's not.
That's right.
It's not who you really are. And then that's the journey, is to reconnect. Who would I have been without the trauma? And that's really me, because underneath all hurting oak trees is a beautiful, unique little acorn, and that's what we need to reconnect with and grow that acorn as adults, rather than identifying with the dysfunctional behaviors we adapted to survive. So part of IFS is gaining self-awareness, and you can't gain self-awareness unless you're willing to approach parts of yourself that you may have hated in a spirit of openness and curiosity and compassion. That's the way in.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you speak to the parts of ourself that we used to hate, what I notice working with individuals is that when we see the behaviors that we used to judge as limiting or self-sabotaging, at the time, you know, like when people spend the time to learn about the difference between protectors and vulnerable parts, then we come to see that protector parts were using the tools that an 8-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 12-year-old would know at the time to prevent the system from being harmed by the threat. So
Yeah,
often,
or a teen
yeah, exactly.
in middle school who smokes a lot of pot or drinks a lot with his or her friends to fit in and not feel that deep loneliness that they felt while they were growing up, because neither mom nor dad was emotionally available. You know, it's just
Yeah,
one of many examples. But
yeah. I've heard like a few clinicians share that one of the big aspects of trauma that has been overlooked historically and is just now in the last few years being addressed as trauma is neglect. And that was such a huge, like, emotional neglect. And it's not even intentional on the parent's part. We've got this, you know, kind of like since the 50s or 60s, both parents working, and then latchkey kids kind
I
of.
was one.
Me too.
I was parked in front of a TV with a bowl of Lucky Charms. You know?
Yeah. Right. And neglect can look like all kinds of variations. Emotional neglect then, you know, has the child not learn attunement. And then what is lack of attunement? How does that, you know, fail forward, so to speak? And not really failing from an intentional place, but just from like a lack of resources.
Oh my
So,
God. Yeah.
yeah.
We are hardwired to attach. And when we have emotionally available and emotionally attuned parents who meet our needs for attachment, we grow up healthy and strong and we enjoy life. But when we reach out with our little chubby fingers for love and nurture, and it's not there, or we cry until we're red in the face for some attention and we get screamed at, right? We are put into a chronic state of fight, flight, and we don't attach. So we basically have to find ways to soothe ourselves
Right.
that are
Great.
dysfunctional,
Yeah, exactly.
that take the place of the attachment.
Yeah.
And it's really sad. This is just my opinion. I know that severe physical and sexual abuse can create the most extreme forms of trauma, like dissociative identity disorder. But the vast majority of people who suffer from childhood trauma as adults, you know, are not that bad off, and they pass for normal, right? They look normal, they sound normal, but they can be deeply distressed and unhappy because of attachment wounds. And they have no idea, because they compare themselves to the kids that got, you know, hit with baseball bats, or the kids who are victims of incest. You don't need any of that to have trauma wounds that affect you throughout life.
It kind of speaks to the older model of like the ACE scores, which, you know, very understandably help to identify, you know, if you're 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 on an ACE score, you're going to have like highly compacted layers of
Mhm.
like many areas of life affected by dysfunctional behaviors and learned behaviors. But if there was emotional neglect, then, you know, it might be a 2 or 3 out of 10 on the ACE score, but might be the inability to trust. And then how does that affect 30 years down the road upon relationship? And so again, you know, I think we're just becoming a much more trauma informed society.
We are,
We
and
are, yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned the ACE study, which
yeah,
was in I believe, the early to mid 1990s. And I think that worked a revolution in
yeah,
the sense that it put trauma on the map,
yeah,
and it made the connection between severe childhood trauma and chronic adult problems,
right.
mental and
Chronic,
physical,
yeah, yeah,
including, yeah, everything from depression and anxiety to obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and so on. But I think we're now in the second revolution. And the second
That's a good
revolution,
way to put it. Yeah,
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 gee, see, you got me talking, and I just came up with something I haven't heard before. But
that's awesome.
I think the second revolution is recognizing that subtle trauma in the form of emotional neglect, which isn't noisy and doesn't
Yeah,
doesn't bring the police to the house, right? But
right.
it's every bit as damaging,
Yeah,
yeah, to the human psyche
yeah.
and to your psychosocial development. Yeah.
And ability to attach and trust and
Oh,
attune. I think attunement is where part of this second revolution that you're talking about, because that's where the good news of, maybe we can close on this, is, you know, with models like IFS and
mhm.
um, somatic experiencing and
And
people
somatic
work,
attachment
yeah, and
therapy.
somatic attachment therapy, is that okay? This happened. Now, who's the potential healer and how? And so it
Yes.
puts the reins back into our hands, giving real tools for like self-attunement, because from the self-attunement, if I become regulated, I have the ability to repair my relationships that have been previously fractured. And that ability now to repair slowly brings whole,
Yes. And it
holistic, yeah, wholesomeness.
totally.
Yeah,
So I think that somatic experiencing and IFS are modalities of self healing that occur in the context of a loving relationship between
yeah,
therapist and client. And when I say loving, obviously it's non-genital, it's agape love,
okay.
meaning that there's warmth and caring, kindness, encouragement, validation, and the client feels safe enough to undergo inner exploration and begin to have compassion for her or his own wounds and begin to heal them. So this is also um, a revolution, I think, because in the old, client or person-centered therapy or client-centered therapy that Carl Rogers
Okay.
invented, there's still a lot of focus on the therapist.
Mm,
And IFS and some of these newer attachment therapies, the therapist becomes a facilitator
yeah.
rather than the outside expert, and facilitates an inner process, the client's inner process. And you and I, just for your listeners, we've done our own sessions together. At a certain point, you don't you don't need the therapist anymore to teach you. Once you master the technique,
That's right.
you can do it with your peers. I don't like to do it alone the way that some people do. I yeah, I much prefer to have a session with a colleague like you and kind of be there for each other,
That's part of
right?
the co-regulation piece. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we heal in community, and we all, what I notice is I do both. I have my, my daily scriber that I notice my parts, and I'll do, the mapping and everything in there, and then I'll bring that. It's kind of like, tilling the soil. I'll bring that into conversations or dialogues or like a session with a
Yeah.
colleague, with a friend. Yeah.
Well, I've always admired that trait of yours, Eileen. Yeah.
My organizer part.
No, you're a busy bee. You're always
Oh.
working and, putting the spade in the soil and turning it over and looking for what's there. And you don't just do that in sessions, in formal sessions. You're always active doing that
Thank you.
when you're
Yeah.
not kayaking.
Thank you. So great to talk with you always, Harvey. And our next chat, maybe we'll continue on from Revolution Part 2.
Okay, sounds good. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
It was